I'm Chloe, 34, a financial advisor who built her practice from nothing after my divorce 3 years ago. For months, my sister-in-law Vanessa had whispered to anyone who'd listen that I was barely keeping it together and would never survive. Without my ex-husband, her pity felt like poison, but I stayed silent until last Tuesday, when she sat in my living room with tears in her eyes, begging me to loan her $50,000 to save her marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd spent years painting me as fragile and dependent was now desperate for my help. But as I listened to her sob story about hidden debts and gambling addictions, I realized this moment wasn't about money at all. It was about the truth she'd been hiding and the strength she'd never seen in me. What happened next would change our family forever, and finally show everyone who was really surviving and who was barely hanging on. If you've ever been underestimated by family who didn't know your true strength, like and subscribe for more stories of quiet triumph and hidden truths. 3 years ago, when I first held those divorce papers in my trembling hands, I never imagined they would become my liberation documents rather than my death sentence. The legal language was cold and clinical, but to me, every clause represented freedom from a marriage that had slowly suffocated my dreams. My ex-husband had been controlling in ways I didn't fully recognize until I was out. He managed our finances, made our social plans, even chose my clothes for important events. When I finally found the courage to leave, everyone expected me to crumble. Vanessa was the first to voice what others whispered. At my brother's birthday dinner, just weeks after the papers were signed, she cornered me in the kitchen. "You know, Chloe, there's no shame in admitting this was a mistake. Some people just aren't built for independence." Her words stung because part of me feared she was right. I'd never lived alone as an adult, never made major financial decisions solo, never even chosen my own car insurance. But something fierce awakened in me that night, determination to prove everyone wrong, especially her. The first months were brutal. I rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, the smell of fresh bread becoming my morning alarm clock. My savings were minimal after legal fees, and my job at a large financial firm felt increasingly hollow. I watched other people's money grow while mine dwindled, but I had something my marriage had never allowed me to fully develop: ambition. Late nights, studying for additional certifications became my new routine. While Vanessa posted social media photos of dinner dates and weekend getaways, I pored over tax codes and investment strategies. The family gatherings during this period were exercises in endurance. Vanessa would inevitably steer conversations toward my situation, as she called it. "How are you managing, sweetie? It must be so hard doing everything yourself now." Her voice dripped with synthetic concern, while her eyes sparkled with something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. I started declining invitations, claiming work commitments. It wasn't entirely untrue. I was working longer hours than ever, building knowledge and connections, but the real reason was self-preservation. Each family dinner felt like a performance where I was cast as the tragic figure, struggling to survive without a man's guidance. What they didn't see were the small victories accumulating. My first independent tax return, filed perfectly. The investment account I opened with my meager savings. The confidence growing with each financial decision I made correctly. I was becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be. But my marriage had never allowed space for her to emerge. The handwritten contract that changed everything was scrawled on lined notebook paper in blue ink, signed by Mrs. Henley, an 82-year-old widow who became my first independent client. She'd lost her husband 6 months earlier and was overwhelmed by financial decisions she'd never had to make alone. "My dear," she said, studying my makeshift business card, "you look like someone who understands what it means to start over." I'd been turned down by 3 other potential clients that week. My lack of established credentials and fancy office space had cost me opportunities with wealthier prospects. But Mrs. Henley saw something they missed: hunger, determination, and genuine care for her situation. Our first meeting took place at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of financial documents her late husband had organized in his meticulous way. Bank statements, insurance policies, investment portfolios, all foreign territory for a woman who trusted her husband to handle the money stuff for 54 years of marriage. "Everyone keeps telling me to find a big firm," she confided, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "But those young men in expensive suits make me feel foolish for asking questions." I spent 3 hours that afternoon, not just reviewing her finances, but listening to her fears. She worried about running Out of money, about making mistakes, about being taken advantage of by people who saw her as an easy target. I recognized her anxiety because I'd felt it myself during those first months of independence. When I presented my analysis the following week, I'd prepared a comprehensive plan that would ensure her financial security while respecting her conservative approach to risk. She signed our agreement on the spot, and I walked home that evening with my first independent commission too, 400 that represented more than money. It represented validation. Word spread slowly through Mrs. Henley's social circle. 3 more widows became clients within 2 months, each bringing unique challenges and modest but meaningful fees. I was building something, brick by brick, client by client. Vanessa, of course, had opinions about my little venture, as she called it. At Christmas dinner, she made a point of asking about my hobby business in front of the entire family. "It's so cute how you're playing businesswoman," she said, her tone suggesting I was a child with a lemonade stand. "But aren't you worried about the liability? The stress? Maybe it would be easier to just find a nice position at an established firm." What she didn't understand was that I'd already considered that path and rejected it. Working for someone else's vision, following someone else's rules, building someone else's dream. I'd done that in my marriage and at my previous job. This was different. This was mine. The late nights continued, but now they had purpose beyond just survival. I was studying advanced portfolio management, learning about estate planning, earning certifications that would legitimize my growing practice. My tiny apartment became command headquarters, with client files organized in a system that made sense to me. The isolation was real though. Family members' subtle dismissiveness hurt more than I wanted to admit. Success felt hollow when no one believed in it. The wedding photo on Vanessa's mantle told a story of perfection that increasingly felt like fiction. She and my brother stood radiant in the frame, her dress flowing like something from a fairy tale, his smile wide and genuine. It had been taken 8 years ago, when their future seemed golden and uncomplicated. Back then, Vanessa had been the family success story college sweetheart who married well, settled into suburban bliss, and seemed to have figured out the secret to happiness that eluded the rest of us. She wore her role as the stable, married sister-in-law like a crown, especially after my divorce made her shine brighter by comparison. Their dinner parties were legendary in our family circle. Vanessa would spend days preparing elaborate meals, decorating their home like something from a magazine, and orchestrating evenings that felt more like performances than gatherings. She had a gift for making everyone feel welcome while simultaneously demonstrating how perfectly she'd crafted her life. But I'd started noticing cracks in the facade, small inconsistencies that my newly sharpened financial instincts caught even when others missed them. My brother would arrive at family events alone more frequently, claiming work commitments. When he did attend, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and excusing himself for important calls. Vanessa compensated by talking more, filling conversational gaps with elaborate stories about their latest purchases, vacation plans, and home improvement projects. She'd upgraded her car twice in 18 months, each time explaining how they'd gotten such a good deal it would have been foolish not to buy. "We're thinking about the lake house again," she'd announced at Easter dinner, her voice bright with excitement. "The market is just so favorable right now, and with my brother's bonus coming, it seems like perfect timing." I'd watched my brother's face during that announcement. He looked surprised, then quickly masked it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the expression of someone learning his own plans from someone else's mouth. The complaints started subtly. Vanessa would mention how expensive everything was getting: groceries, utilities, insurance. But these grumbles were always followed by stories of new purchases or plans for expensive experiences. The contradiction was glaring to someone trained to spot financial inconsistencies, but the family accepted it as normal married couple financial stress. During the same period, my own financial situation was stabilizing and improving. Mrs. Henley had referred 2 more clients, both with more substantial portfolios. I'd moved to a better apartment and purchased reliable furniture instead of the second-hand pieces I'd started with. My wardrobe improved as my income grew, and I'd even started contributing more meaningfully to family gift exchanges and dinner costs. Yet Vanessa continued positioning herself as the example of financial stability while painting me as the cautionary tale. At my niece's birthday party, she pulled me aside with what she presented as sisterly concern. "You know, Chloe, I worry about you sometimes. All this independence is admirable, But don't you think you're putting too much pressure on yourself? There's no shame in accepting that some of us are just better suited for partnership. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore, though I kept my observations to myself. Professional discretion had become second nature, and something told me the truth about their situation would reveal itself soon enough. The family group chat screenshots that my cousin accidentally sent me revealed the systematic nature of Vanessa's campaign to paint me as barely surviving. What I'd assumed were casual comments turned out to be coordinated messaging designed to control the family narrative about my post-divorce life. "Poor Chloe is really struggling," read one message from Vanessa to the group. "She's putting on a brave face, but you can see the stress is getting to her. I think she's in over her head with this business idea." Another thread showed her responding to my aunt's question about my new apartment. "She's trying so hard to seem independent, but I know she's barely making rent. Too proud to ask for help, you know? I worry she'll crash and burn soon." The most painful discovery was how she'd positioned herself as my protector and advocate while simultaneously undermining me. She'd volunteer to check on Chloe after family events, then report back with observations about my supposed financial stress, emotional instability, or questionable decisions. My cousin had sent the screenshots by mistake while trying to forward a different conversation, but the damage to my understanding was complete. I finally grasped why family members had been treating me with such careful kindness, why conversations became awkward when I mentioned business successes, why my opinions on financial matters were dismissed despite my professional expertise. Vanessa had created a narrative where I was the struggling divorcee barely keeping my head above water, while she was the stable married woman generously trying to help her less fortunate sister-in-law. The family had accepted this story completely, which explained their surprised reactions when I'd started demonstrating actual competence and success. The psychological impact was more damaging than I'd initially realized. Constant exposure to this narrative had made me second-guess my own achievements. When clients praised my work, I wondered if they were just being kind. When my income increased, I attributed it to luck rather than skill. Vanessa's whisper campaign had infected my self-perception in ways I was only beginning to understand, but it had also motivated me in unexpected ways. Each dismissive comment fueled my determination to prove them wrong. Every family gathering where I was treated as fragile made me work harder to build something undeniably substantial. Without realizing it, Vanessa had created her own nemesis. My client base continued growing through referrals and networking events. I joined the local Chamber of Commerce and started attending industry conferences. Other financial advisors were beginning to recognize my expertise, particularly in helping women navigate financial independence after major life changes. The irony was that while Vanessa painted me as desperate and failing, I was actually thriving in ways I'd never experienced. My income had surpassed what I'd earned in my previous job. My confidence in financial matters had grown exponentially. My client satisfaction scores were exceptional, and I'd been approached by 2 larger firms about potential partnerships. Yet, at family gatherings, I was still treated as the fragile survivor, the cautionary tale, the woman who'd bitten off more than she could chew. The disconnect between reality and perception had become so extreme that I'd started wondering if anyone would believe the truth if I decided to share it. The bank statement showing a 6-figure balance felt surreal the first time I saw it printed in black and white. 2 years after starting my practice, I'd achieved something I'd never thought possible: genuine financial independence that went beyond mere survival to actual prosperity. My client roster had evolved far beyond the original widows who'd given me my start. Word of mouth had brought me small business owners, young professionals planning for retirement, and even a few high-net-worth individuals who appreciated my personalized approach. Each success built upon the last, creating momentum that sometimes surprised even me. The industry recognition came gradually, then all at once. I'd been invited to speak at a regional conference about serving underserved markets. A financial magazine had quoted my insights on post-divorce financial planning. The local business journal had featured my practice in an article about successful women entrepreneurs. Yet at family gatherings, I remained the struggling divorcee in everyone's eyes. The disconnect had become so profound that I'd stopped trying to correct misperceptions. When relatives asked how I was managing, I'd simply say fine and change the subject. Their assumptions felt too entrenched to challenge directly. My brother had been the only family member to show genuine curiosity about my work, asking technical questions that demonstrated respect for my expertise. But even those conversations happened privately, away from Vanessa's hearing. It was as if acknowledging my success publicly would somehow threaten the established family dynamics. The professional world offered a stark contrast to family perceptions. Other advisors sought my opinion on complex cases. Clients referred friends and colleagues specifically because of my reputation for thoroughness and empathy. I'd been approached about joining professional boards and contributing to industry publications. My new office space reflected this success, a tasteful suite in a respected building, with comfortable furniture and professional artwork. Clients felt confident bringing their financial concerns to someone whose environment suggested competence and stability. The contrast with my early days of kitchen table meetings was dramatic, but the family's image of me remained frozen in time. Locked in those first vulnerable months after my divorce, Vanessa's consistent narrative had created a kind of collective amnesia about my actual progress. Even when I arrived at gatherings in nicer clothes, driving a reliable car, and carrying myself with newfound confidence, the fundamental assumptions remained unchanged. The psychological toll of this invisible success was unexpected. Achievements felt hollow when they went unrecognized by the people closest to me. Professional victories couldn't fully compensate for the family's continued view of me as someone to be pitied rather than celebrated. I'd started keeping my worlds deliberately separate, sharing work successes with professional colleagues while maintaining a modest facade around family. It seemed easier than constantly fighting against entrenched perceptions, but the compartmentalization came with its own costs. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore while Vanessa positioned herself as the family's financial success story. I was quietly building something more substantial than anyone realized. Her performance of stability was becoming increasingly strained, while my actual stability grew stronger every month. The stack of unopened bills on Vanessa's kitchen counter should have been my first concrete clue, but I'd been trained by years of her dismissive comments to doubt my own professional instincts when it came to family matters. It was during my nephew's birthday party, 6 months before that fateful Tuesday visit. I'd offered to help bring dishes from the kitchen when I noticed the pile of utility bills, credit card statements, mortgage correspondence all unopened and accumulating like autumn leaves. My professional alarm bells went off immediately. In my practice, I'd seen this pattern too many times, people overwhelmed by financial problems who cope by avoiding them entirely. The unopened mail was always the first visible sign of deeper trouble, but when I gently mentioned it to Vanessa, she laughed it off with her usual confidence. "Oh, those are just duplicates. We do everything online now." I keep meaning to throw them away. Her explanation was plausible enough that I pushed down my concerns, but the professional part of my brain filed it away with other inconsistencies I'd been noticing. The expensive purchases followed by complaints about money, my brother's increasing absence from family events. The way conversations about finances made them both uncomfortable. At that same party, Vanessa had cornered my mother in the living room, voice pitched just loud enough for me to overhear. "I'm so worried about Chloe. She's trying so hard to seem successful, but you can see the strain. I don't think she realizes how obvious it is that she's struggling." The irony was breathtaking. Here was Vanessa, displaying clear signs of financial distress, using me as a deflection from her own problems. But the family dynamic was so established that her concerns about my supposed struggles were received as genuine worry rather than projection. My brother looked increasingly haggard at each gathering, dark circles under his eyes, distracted responses to questions, and a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. When I asked him privately if everything was okay, he'd force a smile and redirect the conversation. "Just work stress," he'd say. "You know how it is." But I did know how it was, and this looked like more than professional pressure. This looked like someone carrying a secret burden, the kind that keeps you awake at night and makes it hard to focus during the day. Vanessa's behavior was changing too, though more subtly. Her elaborate dinner parties became less frequent. She'd make excuses about being too busy, too tired, or having other commitments. When the family did gather at their house, the spread was simpler, though she'd overcompensate by apologizing extensively for the casual meal. The financial red flags kept mounting. Vanessa would mention needing to juggle some bills or waiting for my brother's next bonus to make certain purchases. She'd bring up expensive items they wanted to buy, then immediately talk about having to wait for the right moment financially. As a financial advisor, I recognize the language of people treading water, trying to maintain appearances while struggling with cash flow. But as a sister-in-law who'd been systematically undermined for years, I second-guessed my professional assessment. Maybe I was just projecting my own past struggles onto their situation. The most telling moment came during a family barbecue, when my father mentioned a home improvement project he was considering. My brother and Vanessa exchanged a look. I recognized the quick, worried glance between partners who share a financial secret. When Dad asked for their contractor recommendation, they made excuses about being too busy to help with research. In my practice, I'd learned that financial stress creates predictable behavioral patterns. The avoidance, the deflection, the way money conversations become charged with anxiety. All the signs were there, but the family's established narrative made it impossible for anyone to see clearly. I was watching a slow-motion financial crisis unfold while being painted as the one in trouble. The casino player's card that fell from my brother's wallet during Thanksgiving dinner was like finding a smoking gun at a crime scene. He'd been reaching for his phone when the plastic rectangle slipped out, landing face up on the hardwood floor, where everyone could see the distinctive logo and his name printed in gold letters. The silence that followed was deafening. My brother's face went white as he quickly scooped up the card, but the damage was done. Vanessa's expression shifted through confusion, recognition, and finally, horrified understanding in the span of about 3 seconds. It's not what it looks like, my brother said quickly, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone who knew exactly what it looked like. Vanessa excused herself to check on dinner, but I caught the tremor in her hands as she walked past. The family pretended nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations became forced, and everyone seemed eager to leave earlier than usual. That card explained so much. The late nights my brother attributed to work, the stress, lines around his eyes, the way he'd become increasingly defensive about money topics. What had started as occasional entertainment had clearly escalated into something much more serious. I'd seen gambling addiction destroy families in my professional practice. The pattern was always the same. It starts small and recreational, then grows into a compulsion that consumes everything. The secrecy, the lies, the mounting debt. It was a financial cancer that spread through every aspect of a person's life. For Vanessa, this revelation must have felt like her world collapsing. Everything she'd built her identity around, the stable marriage, the financial security, the perfect family image, was crumbling beneath feet she'd thought were planted on solid ground. The signs that had seemed like normal marital stress suddenly took on new meaning. My brother's absences weren't work-related. They were trips to casinos. Their cash flow problems weren't temporary setbacks. They were the result of systematic losses that had been hidden from her. I found myself wondering how long this had been going on. Gambling addiction rarely happens overnight. The occasional weekend trips to Atlantic City that my brother had mentioned over the years. The poker nights with friends that seemed to happen more frequently. The way he'd become secretive with his phone and computer. Vanessa's increasing emphasis on my supposed financial struggles now made perfect sense. She'd been projecting her own growing fears about money onto me, using my situation as a way to avoid confronting the reality of her own. Every comment about my supposed instability had been a way of reassuring herself that at least she wasn't the one in trouble. The unopened bills, the expensive purchases followed by financial anxiety, the way both of them became uncomfortable when money topics arose, it all pointed to a couple trying to maintain appearances while their financial foundation eroded beneath them. But what struck me most was how completely the family had bought into the narrative that I was the one struggling. Even with clear evidence of my brother's gambling problem literally falling at our feet, I could see relatives processing this information through the lens of established assumptions. Surely this was just a minor issue. Surely Vanessa had everything under control. Surely I was still the family member they needed to worry about. The addiction had probably started small, maybe just weekend entertainment or stress relief after difficult work weeks. But gambling addiction follows a predictable progression. Wins create confidence, losses create desperation, and desperation drives bigger bets in an attempt to recover losses quickly. By the time that player's card hit the floor, my brother was likely deep in a cycle he couldn't escape alone. And Vanessa, despite all her public confidence, was probably discovering that her perfect marriage was built on a foundation of lies and mounting debt. The eviction notice that Vanessa found taped to their front door on a gray February morning was the moment reality could no longer be denied or deflected. 3 months passed due on mortgage payments, legal action pending, 30 days to vacate the clinical language of financial ruin spelled out in black and white. She'd been living in a strange state of denial since Thanksgiving, convincing herself that my brother's gambling was just a phase, something they could handle quietly as a couple. She'd taken control of their joint accounts, hidden credit cards, and monitored his activities. But gambling addicts are resourceful, and desperation makes them creative. The morning she found that notice, Vanessa told me later, she'd stood on their front porch in her bathrobe, reading and rereading the document as if the words might somehow change. Neighbors walking their dogs had stared, and she'd realized that her carefully maintained image of suburban success was about to crumble in the most public way possible. What Vanessa discovered over the following weeks was devastating in its scope. My brother had opened credit cards in both their names, taken cash advances, borrowed against his $401,000, and even secured a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge. The gambling losses weren't thousands, they were hundreds of thousands. The methodical way he'd hidden the debt was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Bills had been redirected to a post office box he'd rented under a fake business name. Online accounts had been created with passwords she'd never guess, using his mother's maiden name combined with dates from their gambling trips. He'd intercepted, mailed deleted emails, and crafted elaborate explanations for any financial irregularities she noticed. I found 17 different credit card accounts, she would tell me later, her voice hollow with shock. 17. Some I'd never heard of. Some with credit limits higher than our annual income, all maxed out. The paper trail revealed a systematic liquidation of their entire financial life. Their savings account had been drained months earlier. Their children's college funds had been borrowed against. Even their life insurance policies had been used as collateral for loans that had funded weekend trips to Atlantic City and online poker games. When confronted with the eviction notice and the mountain of evidence Vanessa had compiled, my brother finally broke down completely. The confession poured out of him like water from a burst dam: the secret trips to casinos, the online betting accounts, the increasing desperation as losses mounted, and he'd chase them with bigger and bigger bets. I thought I could win it back, he kept repeating, his voice hollow with shock at his own actions. I just needed one good night, one big win, and everything would be okay again. I had systems, strategies that should have worked. He described the twisted logic that had driven his escalating bets. Each loss had convinced him that he was due for a win. Each small victory had convinced him that he'd figured out the system. The psychological trap was perfect: losses demanded larger bets to recover the money. Wins justified larger bets because the system was working. The timeline of destruction was staggering. What had started 3 years ago as occasional weekend entertainment had evolved into daily online gambling sessions during work hours. He'd been placing bets on his phone during family dinners, taking bathroom breaks at birthday parties to check odds on upcoming games. The worst part, he admitted during that first awful conversation, was how good I got at lying. I started believing my own stories about where the money was going. Business expenses, investments, emergency repairs. I convinced myself these weren't lies. They were just temporary explanations until I won everything back. It's the classic gambler's fallacy. The belief that the next bet will solve all the problems created by previous bets. I'd seen it destroy other families in my professional practice, but witnessing it in my own brother was particularly painful. This was someone I'd grown up with, someone I'd thought I knew. For Vanessa, the revelation was catastrophic. Everything she'd believed about her life was false. The financial security she'd flaunted was non-existent. The stable marriage she'd used as a weapon against my supposed failures was actually far more broken than my divorce had ever been. The house they'd lived in for 6 years would have to be sold immediately, assuming they could find a buyer quickly enough to avoid foreclosure. Their credit was destroyed. Their savings were gone. They were facing bankruptcy, and possibly worse if my brother's work discovered the financial irregularities that had funded his gambling. I keep thinking about all the times I worried about you, Vanessa said during one of our later conversations about this period. All the energy I spent convincing everyone that you were the one struggling, while my own world was literally falling apart beneath my feet. But perhaps the most devastating realization for Vanessa was how completely she'd been living a lie. While she'd spent months painting me as financially unstable and emotionally fragile, she'd been married to someone whose addiction was systematically destroying their future. The children had sensed something was wrong for months. My nephew had started having nightmares about losing their house. My niece had been asking questions about why daddy seemed so sad all the time. The stress in their household had been palpable, even though the children didn't understand its source. The eviction notice forced a conversation they'd been avoiding for months. Vanessa finally understood the full scope of their situation, and my brother finally admitted that the problem was beyond his ability to control alone. They needed help, professional help, legal help, and financial help, but asking for help meant admitting the truth to a family who still believed I was the one barely surviving, while they were the stable success story everyone should emulate. The rehearsed speech notes that Vanessa had written on index cards were still visible on her purse when she arrived at my apartment that Tuesday evening. I caught glimpses of key phrases: family helping family, temporary setback, pay you back with interest, as she nervously shuffled through them before settling on my couch. She'd clearly planned this conversation with the same attention to detail she'd once put into her dinner parties. Every word had been chosen for maximum emotional impact, every pause calculated to build sympathy. But the desperation underlying her performance was impossible to hide. "Chloe, I need to talk to you about something important," she began, her voice already wavering with manufactured emotion. "It's about family and loyalty, and being there for each other when things get tough." I watched her transform before my eyes. The confident woman who'd spent years subtly undermining me was being replaced by someone vulnerable and pleading. Her shoulders curved inward, her voice dropped to almost a whisper, and tears began forming in the corners of her eyes. "You know how much you mean to us," she continued, following what was obviously a script. "You're not just my sister-in-law. Your family. And family takes care of each other, right?" The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. She was using every technique in the emotional playbook appeals to family loyalty manufactured. Vulnerability. The implication that helping her was somehow my moral obligation. "We're going through a really difficult time," she said, the tears now flowing freely. "Some unexpected expenses, some bad luck with investments. Nothing we can't handle long term. But right now we need some help bridging the gap." She painted a picture of temporary hardship rather than complete financial collapse, a short-term cash flow problem rather than the devastating addiction and debt that had destroyed their stability. According to her version, $50,000 would solve everything, allowing them to get back on their feet and resume their normal lives. "I know you've been working so hard to build your little business," she said, the condescension still there even in her desperation. "And I'm sure you're doing well enough to help family when they really need it." The assumption that I had money to lend was interesting, given her years of painting me as barely surviving, but she was threading the needle carefully, acknowledging my potential ability to help while maintaining the fiction that I was still fundamentally less stable than she was. "We could pay you back within 6 months with interest," she promised, consulting her notes again. "Better interest than you'd get from any bank. It's really more of an investment opportunity than a loan." I let her finish the entire performance. Before responding, she'd prepared for various objections, concerns about repayment, questions about why they couldn't get traditional financing, suggestions that they ask other family members. But she hadn't prepared for silence. When I didn't immediately respond with either agreement or refusal, her carefully constructed narrative began to crack. She started adding details that contradicted her earlier statements, making the temporary setback sound more serious, the investment opportunity more desperate. "The thing is," she finally admitted, abandoning her script, "we might lose the house if we can't come up with this money quickly. And the kids' school, and everything we've worked for." That was closer to the truth, though still not the complete picture. But it was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all evening, raw fear about losing everything she'd built her identity around. The woman sitting on my couch crying into tissues was the same person who'd spent years telling anyone who'd listen that I'd never survive on my own. The debt consolidation statement that Vanessa finally pulled from her purse with shaking hands told a story far more devastating than her rehearsed speech had suggested. The numbers were staggering: $240,000 in total debt across 17 different accounts, with minimum monthly payments exceeding their combined income by almost $3,000. "This is the real situation," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The performance was over, replaced by raw desperation and shame. I studied the document with my professional eye, recognizing the telltale signs of financial addiction spiraling out of control. Credit card cash advances used to pay other credit cards, personal loans taken to cover gambling losses, home equity lines of credit maxed out to fund what my brother had convinced himself were investment opportunities at casino tables. The timeline painted a picture of accelerating destruction. What had started 3 years ago as occasional weekend trips had evolved into a systematic liquidation of their entire financial life. Every asset had been leveraged. Every credit line had been exhausted. They weren't just broke, they were financially destroyed in ways that would take years to repair, if repair was even possible. "The 50,000 isn't really enough," Vanessa admitted, the words tumbling out now that the facade had cracked. "But we hoped maybe if we could just stop the foreclosure, buy some time, we could figure out the rest." Her confession revealed the depth of their delusion. $50,000 wouldn't even cover 2 months of their minimum debt payments, much less address the underlying gambling addiction or restore their financial stability. They were grasping at solutions that couldn't possibly work because accepting the real scope of the problem was too overwhelming. As she walked me through the documentation, the full scope of deception became clear. My brother had been living multiple financial lives, each hidden from the others. The respectable family man who attended school events and hosted barbecues was also the desperate gambler who'd taken cash advances during lunch breaks to fund afternoon betting sessions. "I found betting slips in his coat pockets," she said, pulling out a manila envelope filled with evidence she'd been collecting. Hundreds of them. Some for amounts I couldn't even process. $5,000 on a single football game, $10,000 on a basketball playoff series. The betting slips told their own story of escalating desperation. Early ones showed modest amounts, $50 or $100 on weekend games. But as losses mounted, the bets had grown larger and more frequent. Weekend entertainment had become daily compulsion, with stakes that increased as his desperation grew. "How long have you known?" I asked gently. The question broke something inside her. She sobbed openly, no longer caring about appearances or manipulation. "I found the first credit card statement 6 months ago. He promised it was just that one, just a temporary thing. But every week there was something new. Another account, another loan, another lie." The pattern was heartbreakingly familiar from my professional experience with addiction-related financial crises. Each revelation had been followed by promises of reform, each promise broken by the next desperate bet. Vanessa had been living in a state of constant crisis management, discovering new damage faster than she could process the implications. "I kept thinking I could fix it," she continued, her voice breaking. "I took over all the accounts I knew about. I hid his credit cards. I even went with him to a counselor twice. But he always found new ways to get money. He'd taken loans from his work retirement account, borrowed against his life insurance policy, even used the kids' social security numbers to open credit cards." The revelation about using their children's identities was particularly devastating. It suggested a level of desperation that had overcome even basic parental protective instincts. My nephew and niece, ages 8 and 10, were already victims of their father's addiction in ways they wouldn't understand for years. "I found online betting accounts I'd never heard of," she said, showing me printed statements from various gambling websites, poker sites, sports betting, even cryptocurrency gambling platforms. He'd funded them with cash advances, wire transfers, even our grocery money. The evidence she'd assembled was overwhelming in its scope. Bank statements showing cash withdrawals at casinos, credit card statements with charges to gambling websites, loan documents for amounts that boggled the mind. Each piece of paper represented another lie, another betrayal, another step toward financial ruin. "The worst part," she said, looking directly at me for the first time that evening, "is that while this was happening, I was telling everyone you were the one struggling. I was so scared about our problems, and focusing on your situation made me feel like at least someone was worse off than we were." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd received, though it was wrapped in the admission that her years of undermining me had been psychological self-protection rather than genuine concern. She'd used my supposed struggles as a security blanket, a way to avoid confronting the reality of her own family's crisis. I convinced myself that as long as you were the one everyone worried about, nobody would look too closely at us, she continued. Every time I talked about your problems, it reinforced the idea that we were the stable ones, the ones who had everything under control. The psychological mechanism was understandable, but devastating in its impact. By maintaining focus on my supposed struggles, she'd enabled both her own denial and my brother's continued deception. The family's attention had been systematically directed away from the real crisis while being focused on fabricated concerns about my stability. The documentation she'd brought painted a picture of complete financial devastation that went far beyond what $50,000 could address. They owed more than their house was worth. Their credit scores had plummeted into ranges that would make future borrowing nearly impossible. My brother's gambling had cost them not just their savings, but their entire financial future. What does he say about all this now? I asked, gesturing to the mountain of evidence. He keeps saying he can win it back, she replied, fresh tears starting. Even now, even with all this evidence, he believes the next bet will solve everything. He doesn't understand that there is no winning back from this hole. The addiction has convinced him that the problem is just bad luck, not the gambling itself. That delusion was perhaps the most frightening aspect of their situation. My brother wasn't just financially destroyed, he was psychologically unable to grasp the reality of what he'd done to their family. Until that fundamental disconnect was addressed through professional treatment, any financial assistance would simply fund his next gambling binge. Looking at Vanessa surrounded by the evidence of their family's destruction, I realized that the woman who'd spent years painting me as weak and desperate had actually been living in a nightmare of deception and addiction that made my divorce seem like a minor inconvenience. The role reversal was so complete it was almost surreal. The voice recording on my phone captured the moment everything changed between us. I'd started recording when Vanessa began contradicting her own statements about their financial situation, my professional instincts telling me to document the conversation for both our protection. Vanessa, I said quietly, before we talk about money, I need to address something else. For 3 years, you've been telling everyone I was barely surviving, that I'd never make it on my own, that I was too proud to ask for help when I was obviously struggling. Her face went pale as she realized where this conversation was heading. I have screenshots of family group chats where you painted me as desperate and failing. I have witnesses to dozens of conversations where you questioned my stability, my judgment, and my ability to support myself. I pulled out my phone and played back some of her own words from earlier that evening. I know you've been working so hard to build your little business. The condescension was unmistakable when heard in isolation. You called my successful financial practice a hobby business and a little venture. You told my mother I was playing at being a businesswoman. You've spent years positioning yourself as the stable, successful sister-in-law who had to worry about poor, struggling Chloe. Each example I cited made her shrink further into my couch. The woman who'd sat here an hour ago with rehearsed manipulation was being replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of her hypocrisy. And now, I continued, you're sitting in my apartment, begging me for $50,000. Because your stable marriage and secure finances were actually built on gambling addiction and massive debt. She tried to interrupt with weak justifications. That's not fair. I was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? I asked sharply. From success? From independence? From proving that I could build something meaningful on my own? The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, Vanessa had no ready answer, no deflection, no way to make herself look like the reasonable one in our dynamic. Let me tell you what was actually happening while you were spreading concerns about my stability, I said, opening my laptop to show her some documentation I'd prepared. My practice has grown to serve 43 clients with over $12 million in assets under management. I've been featured in 3 professional publications and invited to speak at 2 industry conferences. Her eyes widened as she saw the numbers, the testimonials, the evidence of genuine success that contradicted everything she'd believed or claimed about my situation. My income last year was more than you and my brother made combined. Even before his gambling destroyed your finances. I own my apartment outright. I have 6 months of expenses and emergency savings. I'm contributing the maximum to my retirement accounts and still have money left over for investments. Each fact was like another nail in the coffin of the narrative she'd constructed. The struggling divorcee she'd invented didn't exist and never had. So when you come here with tears and manipulation, asking me to bail you out of a crisis that you helped create through years of financial irresponsibility, after spending those same years undermining my reputation and questioning my capabilities, what exactly did you expect my response to be? She had no answer because there was no reasonable answer. The situation was so absurd that even acknowledging it fully would require her to confront the depth of her own self-deception. I'm not angry about the money request, I continued. Family crises happen, and people need help sometimes. I'm angry about the years of psychological manipulation, the systematic campaign to make me doubt my own success, and the complete inability to acknowledge your own problems while obsessing over mine. The recording captured her whispered response. I didn't realize I thought you thought what? That keeping me down would somehow keep you up? That my failure would make your success more secure? The truth was probably more complex than simple malice. Vanessa's undermining had likely been driven by her own insecurities and growing awareness that her marriage had serious problems, but the impact on me had been real, regardless of her intentions. The handwritten contract terms I placed on the coffee table between us shocked Vanessa into complete silence. She'd expected either immediate rejection or emotional rescue. She hadn't prepared for a professional, systematic response to her crisis. I'm not saying no to helping, I said carefully, but I'm also not saying yes to being manipulated or taken advantage of. If we're going to do this, it has to be done properly. The first condition was non-negotiable: complete financial transparency. Vanessa and my brother would need to provide access to all accounts, credit reports, tax returns, and documentation of debts. No hidden cards, no secret accounts, no partial truths. I would conduct a full financial audit before committing to any assistance. I can't help solve a problem I don't fully understand, I explained. And based on tonight's conversation, I don't think you fully understand it either. The second condition was professional intervention. My brother would need to enter a certified gambling addiction treatment program, not just counseling, but intensive treatment with accountability measures. Vanessa would need to attend related support groups for families affected by gambling addiction. This isn't just a financial crisis, I said gently but firmly. It's an addiction crisis. Money won't solve anything if the underlying compulsion isn't addressed professionally. The third condition was perhaps the most difficult for her to accept: a family meeting where the truth about both our situations would be revealed. The years of misinformation about my supposed struggles would be corrected, and the reality of their financial crisis would be acknowledged. I'm not interested in humiliating you, I clarified, but I'm also not interested in continuing to be the family scapegoat while enabling denial about serious problems. Vanessa's face cycled through emotions as she processed these requirements. Relief that I wasn't refusing to help, anxiety about the level of exposure and accountability I was demanding, and something that looked like genuine remorse about the family dynamics we'd need to address. There's more, I continued, consulting my notes. Any financial assistance would be structured as a formal loan with legal documentation, market rate interest, and a realistic repayment schedule based on their actual income after debt payments. This isn't a gift, it's a business transaction between family members. The business approach seemed to surprise her most. She'd expected either emotional rejection or emotional rescue, but I was offering neither. I was treating their crisis with the same professional competence I brought to my clients' problems. Finally, I said, this help comes with ongoing financial oversight, monthly check-ins, budget reviews, and progress reports on both the addiction treatment and debt repayment. If there are any relapses, hidden accounts, or dishonesty about the situation, the assistance stops immediately. I slid the written summary across the table. These aren't punitive measures, Vanessa. They're the same recommendations I'd make to any client facing similar challenges. Gambling addiction and financial crisis require systematic, professional responses. She stared at the document for a long time before speaking. This is more complicated than I expected. Your situation is more complicated than you expected, I corrected. What I'm offering is proportionally comprehensive help that actually addresses the underlying problems rather than just throwing money at symptoms. The loan amount I was prepared to consider was smaller than her original request, $25,000, which would be enough to prevent immediate foreclosure but not enough to solve all their problems. The remainder would need to come From selling assets, negotiating with creditors, and developing sustainable spending habits, this approach treats you like adults who can recover from this crisis, I explained, rather than victims who need to be rescued. But it requires you to do the work, real work on the addiction, real work on financial management, and real work on honest family relationships. Vanessa's response would tell me everything I needed to know about whether they were ready for genuine change or just looking for someone else to enable their continued dysfunction. The financial portfolio summary I presented at our family meeting created the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for medical emergencies or tragic news. My parents, siblings, and extended family members stared at the documents spread across my brother's dining room table, trying to reconcile the numbers with their established understanding of family dynamics. Chloe's practice manages over $12 million in client assets, I said simply, letting the figure speak for itself. Her annual income last year exceeded what most of us make, and her business growth trajectory suggests continued expansion. My mother was the first to find her voice. But we thought you always seemed so struggling, I supplied gently. That was the narrative Vanessa created and maintained for 3 years. Not because it was true, but because it served her psychological needs while she dealt with the reality of her own situation. The revelation of my actual success was shocking enough, but it was followed by the more devastating truth about my brother and Vanessa's financial crisis. The gambling addiction, the hidden debt, the systematic deception that had brought them to the brink of losing everything. My aunt was shaking her head in disbelief. All those times Vanessa called to check on Chloe, worried about how she was managing were projection, I finished. She was terrified about their own problems and found it psychologically easier to focus on my supposed struggles than confront the reality of their situation. The family group chat screenshots I shared were perhaps the most damaging evidence. Seeing Vanessa's systematic campaign to paint me as barely surviving while positioning herself as the stable success story was painful for everyone to witness. I feel like such an idiot, my cousin admitted. I've been treating you like you might break at any moment, and you've been more successful than any of us realized. Vanessa sat in mortified silence as the extent of her deception became clear to everyone. Not just the financial lies about their situation, but the psychological manipulation she'd used to control family perceptions and deflect attention from their real problems. My brother spoke for the first time since we'd begun the meeting. I enabled this, he said quietly. Every time Vanessa talked about Chloe's problems, I stayed silent because I was grateful someone else was being seen as the family concern. It meant nobody was looking too closely at what I was doing. The complicity was broader than just Vanessa's manipulation. The family had participated by accepting her narrative without question, by treating me with careful kindness instead of normal respect, by assuming my professional success was somehow fragile or temporary. The gambling addiction started small. My brother continued, his voice hollow with shame. Weekend trips that seemed harmless. But it grew into something I couldn't control, and rather than face it, I let Vanessa create this story about Chloe being the one with problems. The financial documentation they presented was devastating in its scope. Credit cards, personal loans, home equity lines of credit, retirement account, borrowing every possible source of funds had been exhausted to feed the addiction. The minimum monthly payments on their debt exceeded their combined income by almost $2,000. We need professional help, Vanessa finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Not just money, real help with the addiction, the debt management, everything. We've been living in denial for so long that we don't even know how to start fixing this. The contrast between their situation and mine was stark enough to make everyone uncomfortable. While they'd been presenting themselves as the family success story, they'd actually been spiraling toward financial ruin. While they'd painted me as struggling and unstable, I'd been building something genuinely substantial. What hurts most, my father said slowly, is that we treated Chloe like she was fragile, when she was actually the strongest person in the room. The family meeting forced everyone to confront their own assumptions and biases. They'd accepted Vanessa's narrative partly because divorce carries stigma, partly because they'd never seen a woman in our family build an independent business, and partly because it was easier than asking hard questions about what they were observing. The revelation changed our family dynamics immediately. Instead of being treated as someone to worry about, I was suddenly being asked for advice, opinions, and professional insights. The shift was dramatic and honestly, a little overwhelming. After years of being dismissed, my uncle, who'd barely spoken to me beyond pleasantries for years, suddenly wanted to discuss his retirement planning. My cousin asked about college savings, strategies for her daughter. Even my father, who'd always been skeptical of my risky career choice, began seeking my opinion on investment decisions. "I need to apologize," my mother said, her voice heavy with regret. "I've been so worried about you for so long, and all this time you were the one who had everything figured out. I feel like I failed you as a mother by not seeing your strength." The emotional weight of these admissions was almost harder to process than years of dismissal had been. Each family member seemed to need to confess their own complicity in perpetuating Vanessa's narrative, their own failure to recognize what I'd actually accomplished. "We all participated in this," my father acknowledged. "We saw what we expected to see instead of what was actually in front of us. That's on us, not just on Vanessa." The meeting lasted 4 hours, with breaks for tears, difficult conversations, and the kind of honest family discussion we'd never had before. By the end, everyone understood both the scope of my success and the depth of my brother and Vanessa's crisis. The family's entire understanding of who needed support and who could provide it had been completely inverted. The loan agreement draft sat on my desk for 3 days before I signed it, representing the internal struggle between justice and compassion that had been consuming me since that Tuesday evening conversation. Part of me wanted to refuse. The years of systematic undermining, the psychological manipulation, the way my own family had been turned against my success, all of it seemed to warrant consequences rather than rescue. Vanessa had spent 3 years painting me as weak and dependent, then turned to me for help the moment her own facade crumbled. But another part of me recognized that my brother's children would suffer if their parents lost the house. My niece and nephew, ages 8 and 10, had no responsibility for the choices that created this crisis. Punishing Vanessa and my brother would inevitably punish 2 innocent kids who were already dealing with the stress of their parents' problems. My professional mentor, Mrs. Henley, offered perspective during one of our regular coffee meetings. At 84, she'd seen enough family dynamics to provide wisdom beyond her original role as my first client. "Sweetness," she said in her gentle way, "sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help people who don't deserve it. Not because they've earned your kindness, but because you've earned the right to choose your own character." Her words resonated because they captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. This decision wasn't really about Vanessa and my brother, it was about who I wanted to be when faced with the power to help or harm. The years of dismissal and manipulation had given me an opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure. I consulted with 2 other financial advisors who specialized in addiction-related financial recovery. Both confirmed that my conditions were appropriate and necessary. Professional treatment for gambling addiction wasn't optional, it was the foundation that would determine whether any financial assistance would be meaningful or just enable continued dysfunction, without addressing the underlying compulsion. One advisor explained, "You're essentially funding his next gambling binge. The money will disappear, and you'll be back where you started within months." The transparency requirements weren't punishment. They were the same accountability measures I'd recommend to any client facing similar challenges. Hidden accounts and secret spending had created this crisis. Ongoing honesty about money was the only path forward. I spent considerable time researching gambling addiction treatment programs, recovery statistics, and long-term success rates. The numbers were sobering. Even with professional treatment, relapse rates remained high, and financial recovery could take years even under the best circumstances. But I also learned about families who had successfully navigated similar crises. The common factors in successful recovery stories were early intervention, comprehensive treatment, family support with appropriate boundaries, and complete financial transparency. My conditions addressed each of these elements. The family meeting had been painful but necessary. Years of misinformation needed to be corrected, not for my ego, but for the health of our relationships going forward. I couldn't continue being treated as the family member to worry about while enabling denial about serious problems. The legal documentation I was preparing would protect everyone involved. Clear terms, realistic repayment schedule, market rate, interest, and specific conditions that would void the agreement if violated. This wasn't family charity, it was a business transaction that happened to involve relatives. When I finally signed the agreement, It was with full awareness that I might never see the money returned, but I'd structured the assistance to minimize my risk while maximizing their chance of genuine recovery. $25,000 was enough to prevent immediate foreclosure, but not enough to solve all their problems. The decision process had taught me something important about my own growth. 3 years ago, fresh from my divorce and struggling to establish independence, I would have either refused out of hurt feelings or agreed out of people-pleasing instincts. Now I was making a decision based on careful analysis, clear boundaries, and genuine compassion. Vanessa's acceptance of all conditions told me she was finally ready to face reality rather than just looking for someone else to enable their continued dysfunction. Her willingness to attend family addiction support groups, submit to financial oversight, and acknowledge her years of undermining behavior suggested genuine remorse rather than just desperation. The phone call where I informed them of my decision was brief and businesslike. "I'll provide the loan under the conditions we discussed," I said simply. "The money will be available once all documentation is complete and treatment programs begin." Vanessa's response was a whispered thank you followed by what sounded like genuine crying. My brother's voice was thick with emotion when he said, "I know I don't deserve this, but I promise I'll do the work to get better." Time would tell whether those promises held, but I'd done everything possible to structure their success while protecting my own interests and maintaining appropriate boundaries. The thank you card from Vanessa arrived 6 weeks after our loan agreement was signed, and it represented the first genuine acknowledgement of my strength I'd received from her in 3 years. The handwriting was shaky, as if the words were difficult to form, but the message was clear. "Thank you for seeing past my mistakes to help our family. I'm learning to see you as you really are." The transformation in our family dynamics was gradual but unmistakable. Vanessa's attendance at Gamblers Anonymous family support groups was giving her language to understand the psychological patterns that had driven her behavior. The systematic undermining of my success hadn't been conscious malice, it had been a coping mechanism for dealing with her own growing awareness that their marriage had serious problems. "I couldn't face how bad things were getting," she explained. During one of our monthly financial check-ins, "Every time I thought about our debt or his gambling, I'd panic. But talking about your supposed problems made me feel like at least someone was worse off than we were." The psychological defense mechanism was understandable if destructive. By maintaining focus on my supposed struggles, she'd avoided confronting the reality of their situation until crisis forced acknowledgement. My brother's progress in addiction treatment was more uneven but still meaningful. The intensive program required daily group meetings, individual therapy, twice weekly, and complete financial transparency. His gambling triggers were being systematically addressed, and the shame that had driven him to hide his problem was slowly being replaced by accountability. The 90-day milestone in his recovery had been particularly significant. I attended the family session at his treatment center, where he read a letter he'd written to me about the impact of his addiction on our family relationships. "I let Vanessa paint you as struggling because it meant nobody was looking at what I was doing," he read, his voice breaking. "I used your supposed problems as camouflage for my real problems. That was cowardly and wrong, and I'm sorry." Family gatherings had taken on a completely different character. Instead of Vanessa's elaborate performances of domestic perfection, we gathered more casually, with honest conversation replacing the careful maintenance of appearances. My success was now openly acknowledged and even celebrated, while their recovery was supported without pretense. The most significant change was in how family members related to me professionally. My expertise was finally being recognized and sought out. When my cousin faced a job change with complex stock option implications, she asked for my advice. When my parents considered refinancing their mortgage, they consulted me first. "I feel stupid for not recognizing what you'd built," my mother admitted during a quiet moment at Sunday dinner. "We treated you like you were barely holding on when you were actually the most financially secure person in the family." The shift in respect was gratifying but also overwhelming. Years of being dismissed had made me self-reliant in ways that didn't easily accommodate suddenly being seen as the family financial expert. I appreciated the recognition while also maintaining the boundaries I'd developed during the harder years. My practice had benefited from the family's new understanding and support. Referrals from relatives who finally understood my expertise had brought in several high-quality clients. More importantly, The emotional energy I'd been spending on managing family dismissal could now be redirected toward professional growth. Vanessa's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The woman who'd once condescended about my little business was now genuinely interested in understanding how I'd built something sustainable. She asked thoughtful questions about client relationships, business development, and financial planning, not with the intention of competing, but with genuine curiosity about skills she recognized she lacked. I always assumed success meant having the right husband and the right house, she reflected during one of our coffee meetings that had become regular occurrences. I never understood that real security comes from building something yourself, something that can't be taken away by someone else's bad choices. Her support group participation had given her tools for understanding her own psychological patterns. The need to diminish my success had been rooted in her own insecurities about her lack of independent identity and growing awareness of her marriage's problems. The monthly financial reviews showed steady progress in their debt reduction. The house had been saved from foreclosure, though they'd needed to refinance at higher rates due to their damaged credit. My brother's gambling treatment was showing results. He'd successfully completed 90 days without any betting activity and was working on longer-term recovery strategies. Their lifestyle had necessarily become more modest, but it was also more honest. Instead of expensive dinners out that strained their budget, they hosted potluck gatherings. Instead of elaborate vacations they couldn't afford, they planned local activities. The performance of affluence had been replaced by the reality of careful budgeting and gradual recovery. The children were responding positively to the increased honesty in their household. My nephew had told me privately that he liked having his parents available for homework help instead of always being stressed about grown-up stuff they wouldn't explain. My niece had started showing interest in my work, asking questions about money management. That suggested she was learning healthy financial attitudes from observing our family's recovery process. Most importantly, the toxic dynamic that had characterized our relationship was dissolving. Vanessa no longer needed to diminish my success to feel secure about her own situation. I no longer needed to prove my stability to family members who finally saw it clearly. We were building something new based on mutual respect and honest acknowledgement of each other's strengths and struggles. The business partnership proposal that arrived in my email 6 months after the loan agreement represented recognition I'd never expected from my brother himself. His recovery program had included career counseling, and he developed a plan to rebuild his professional reputation while contributing to gambling addiction awareness in workplace settings. I want to help other families avoid what we went through, he wrote in his proposal, and I think your financial expertise combined with my firsthand experience with addiction could create something meaningful. The idea was compelling, a consulting service that helped employers recognize and address gambling addiction among their workforce while providing financial counseling for affected families. My brother's corporate experience and my financial planning credentials could complement each other in ways that served a genuine need. But more than the business opportunity, his proposal represented genuine acknowledgement of my professional competence. The brother who'd stayed silent while Vanessa undermined my success was now actively seeking to partner with that same expertise he'd once allowed to be dismissed. My practice continued thriving, with the new recognition from family members translating into referrals from their social circles. Word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients had always been my primary marketing strategy, but having family members who finally understood and supported my work amplified those efforts significantly. The industry recognition that had started years earlier was now being supplemented by speaking opportunities specifically focused on financial recovery after family crises. My experience helping my brother and Vanessa navigate their situation had given me insights that resonated with other professionals dealing with similar cases. Vanessa's transformation had become one of the most gratifying aspects of the entire experience. The woman who'd once patronized my hobby business was now attending my speaking engagements and introducing me to potential clients with genuine pride. I want people to know how wrong I was, she said after one of my presentations. And I want them to see what real strength looks like. Her support groups had helped her understand that her years of focusing on my supposed problems had been a form of psychological projection, avoiding her own growing fears about their marriage. By creating external focus on someone else's perceived struggles, I convinced myself that you were the one who needed watching, who needed protection, she explained during one of our now regular coffee meetings. But you were actually the one who had figured out how to build something sustainable and secure. The most meaningful change was in their children's perception of their situation. My niece and nephew had initially been confused and frightened by the dramatic changes in their family's circumstances. But as their parents' recovery progressed and honesty replaced secrecy, the children began to thrive in ways that surprised everyone. Mom doesn't cry in the bathroom anymore, my nephew had confided to me during a recent family gathering. And Dad actually plays with us instead of just checking his phone. The family's financial situation was stabilizing gradually. They'd successfully avoided foreclosure and were making steady progress on debt reduction. My brother's addiction treatment had given him tools for managing triggers and maintaining accountability. Vanessa's therapy had helped her develop healthier coping mechanisms for stress and anxiety. The loan repayment schedule was being met consistently, though I'd privately decided that if they continued their progress in treatment and recovery, I might eventually forgive portions of the debt. The money had never been the primary concern. The behavioral changes and honest relationships were far more valuable outcomes. Most importantly, our family gatherings had become genuine celebrations rather than performances. People shared real struggles and authentic successes, instead of maintaining carefully crafted facades. The toxic dynamic that had characterized our relationships was being replaced by mutual support and honest communication. The family photo taken at my nephew's 10th birthday party tells a completely different story than the wedding portrait that once dominated Vanessa's mantle. Instead of posed perfection, it captures genuine joy. Adults who've learned to be honest with each other and children who no longer live in a house filled with secrets and tension. Looking at that image now, I can barely recognize the family dynamics that existed just 18 months ago. The woman everyone worried about has become the person others seek out for advice and support. The couple who seemed to have everything figured out has learned to find strength in vulnerability and honest recovery. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. Recovery from gambling addiction is a lifelong process, and rebuilding trust after years of deception takes consistent effort. But my brother has now maintained sobriety from gambling for over a year, attending meetings regularly and serving as a sponsor for newer members of his support group. His journey through treatment revealed the depth of shame and self-deception that had fueled his addiction. In family therapy sessions, he described gambling as an escape from the pressure of maintaining the perfect family image that Vanessa had cultivated. The irony was devastating. Her need for appearance of success had contributed to the very behaviors that destroyed their actual security. I felt like I was always failing to live up to the life she'd created, he explained during one particularly difficult session. Gambling gave me a few hours where I could imagine winning enough to finally deserve everything we pretended to have. Vanessa's journey has been equally significant. The woman who once defined herself through her husband's achievements and her perfectly maintained home has discovered her own capabilities and interests. She's returned to school to finish the degree she abandoned when they married, studying addiction counseling with plans to help other families facing similar crises. I spent so many years being afraid of not being enough, she told me recently, that I never discovered what I actually was capable of becoming. Her transformation included a deep reckoning with her treatment of me over the years. In one of our monthly coffee meetings, she'd brought a notebook filled with specific instances where she'd undermined my success or questioned my capabilities. I need to acknowledge each of these, she said, her voice heavy with remorse. Not just the general pattern, but the specific ways I hurt you and damaged your reputation with our family. The detailed apology had been painful but necessary. Hearing her recount specific comments, family conversations where she'd painted me as struggling, and moments where she deliberately redirected attention from my successes to my supposed problems forced both of us to confront the full scope of the damage that had been done. But perhaps more meaningful than the apologies was watching her develop genuine respect for what I'd built. She'd started referring friends to my practice, not out of obligation, but because she finally understood my expertise. When her own support group needed a financial planning workshop, she'd ask me to present, introducing me with pride rather than the condescending tone she'd once used. The business partnership my brother had proposed had evolved into something meaningful for both our professional lives. Our consulting service had helped 12 companies develop gambling addiction awareness programs, and we'd provided financial counseling to over 40 affected families. The work was personally fulfilling in ways that purely profit-driven activities could never be. My own practice continues to grow, but more importantly, it's now supported by family members who understand and celebrate what I've built. The isolation that characterized my early success has been replaced by genuine community and mutual support. The most profound change is in how we talk about strength and survival. The family narrative used to cast me as barely managing while celebrating Vanessa's apparent stability. Now we understand that true strength often looks quiet and steady rather than flashy and performative. My divorce, which was once seen as evidence of my fragility, is now recognized as the catalyst that allowed me to discover capabilities I'd never been able to develop within the constraints of that marriage. The business I built, which was once dismissed as desperate attempt to prove something, is now appreciated as evidence of genuine expertise and determination. The financial assistance I provided has been fully repaid, ahead of schedule, but more importantly, it served as a bridge that allowed my brother and Vanessa to rebuild their lives on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. The crisis that could have destroyed our family relationships instead became the catalyst for developing deeper, more authentic connections. My niece and nephew have become regular visitors to my office, fascinated by the work I do and the independence I've created. My nephew wants to be an entrepreneur when he grows up, and my niece has started a small jewelry making business that she runs with impressive attention to profit margins and customer service. I want to be strong like Aunt Chloe, she'd told her mother, according to Vanessa. I want to build something that can't be taken away. The children's perspective on our family crisis has been surprisingly mature. They understand that their father had a sickness that made him make bad choices with money, and that recovery is an ongoing process requiring daily attention. They've learned that financial security comes from hard work and honest planning, not from appearances or luck. Sometimes I think about that Tuesday evening when Vanessa sat crying on my couch, begging for money while still unconsciously condescending to my little business. The irony was so sharp it was almost painful. The woman who'd spent years painting me as weak and dependent, turning to me as her only hope for salvation. But what I've learned is that survival isn't about never needing help, it's about building something sustainable enough that you can provide help when others need it. Real strength isn't about maintaining perfect appearances, it's about weathering genuine crises with grace and growing from the experience. The family photo on my desk now shows people who've learned to see each other clearly, support each other honestly, and celebrate each other authentically. It's not perfect, but it's real in ways our previous relationships never were. My brother looks relaxed in a way he hadn't for years, his arm around children who no longer worry about grown-up secrets. Vanessa's smile reaches her eyes instead of being carefully arranged for the camera, and I'm standing among them not as someone to be worried about or pitied, but as someone whose strength has been tested and proven, whose success has been acknowledged and celebrated, whose character has been demonstrated through actions rather than words. The woman they once saw as barely surviving is now recognized as the one who was thriving all along. That, I've discovered, is what actual survival looks like, not just weathering the storm, but building something strong enough to shelter others when their own storms hit.